El Gobierno de la Ciudad de México, a través de la Secretaría de Cultura, editoriales participantes y para leer en libertad, invitan a la Feria Internacional del Libro Zócalo Virtual 2020. Presentaciones, charlas, debates, homenajes y más del 9 al 18 de octubre de las 12 del día a las 12 de la noche a través de la página filzocalo.cdmx.gov.mx. No te pierdas nuestras actividades a través de nuestro canal de YouTube, todos los días de 8 a 9 de la noche y en otros horarios que puedes consultar en la página brigadaparaLeerEnLibertad.com. Búscanos en redes sociales y sigue las transmisiones para conocer nuestro catálogo de ventas y llevarte libros de regalo que podrás recoger en la Castañeda 44, Colonia Mixcoac. Feria Internacional de Libros Zócalo Virtual 2020, del 9 al 18 de octubre. Para leer en libertad.
Buenas noches, bienvenidos a esta charla con Amy Goodman y Tariq. Estamos en la 20ª edición de la Feria del Libro del Zócalo y es para nosotros en la brigada una fiesta tener a dos personalidades internacionales tan importantes como Amy y Tariq. Amy, como saben, dirige y aparece en el programa Democracy Now!, un programa de noticias diario que lleva 24 años cubriendo y transmitiendo en más de 1,400 estaciones de radio y televisión y por internet todos los movimientos sociales que suceden en Estados Unidos y además dibujando un panorama internacional en su noticiario diario que lo hace una recomendación indispensable para estar bien informado. Y Tariq es un activista político, periodista, novelista, escritor y pensador que ha estado con nosotros en varias ferias. En 2013, semanas después de que los maestros fueron evacuados del Zócalo, y en 2018 para presentar su biografía de activismo a 50 años del 68, como él lo vivió en Europa y como se vivió en México. Entonces, pues bienvenidos, es un gusto tenerlos aquí, Tariq y Eme, a esta charla tan especial. Muchas gracias por aceptar la invitación.
Well, it's a great honor to be with you, and congratulations on the 10th anniversary of the Zócalo International Book Festival. You know, I really do look forward to coming down at a time when we can all actually gather. Who would have thought that it's a revolutionary act just to be together? And now with COVID preventing these kinds of gatherings, we even more appreciate what it means when we can be shoulder to shoulder. Virtual has its place and it's a way around what we're dealing with now, but it is so important when people gather together, and it just makes me appreciate that more. Right now in the United States, as you know, we are living through an absolute crisis, one of the most dire times in our history. I won't even talk about just election day being November 3rd, because the election voting has already started all over the country. And it is why the president of the United States, Donald Trump, is continually attacking voting, because it's happening now in state after state. And he wants to terrorize those he doesn't want to vote. And I'll say it's the majority of people in the United States. Republicans increasingly understand they cannot win. You know, President Trump's party, not that he's a real Republican, they cannot win with the majority vote. They can only win by suppressing the vote. And so President Trump, not only in the last days, but has intensified saying that he will not endorse a peaceful transition. He will not guarantee this. And you might have thought, who cares if his opponent, Joe Biden, wins, you know, their people will take him out of the White House. But it is not as simple as that. He is trying to gum up the works well before then by preventing people from registering the franchise, their vote. In Florida, there was a popular amendment that passed overwhelmingly that allowed people who'd served time in prison, at this point it's like 1.4 million people, when they come out, that they should be able to vote. And it was led by a man named Desmond Meade, who Time magazine just talked about as being one of the most 100 influential people in the world, African-American, former prisoner who came out and said, no, I have served my time. I should be able to vote. Overwhelmingly, the people of Florida voted for this restoration of rights. And now, as we come closer to the election, and the Florida governor is in lockstep with the president of the United States, they have said that anyone who served time in jail has to pay every penny of whatever they owe through the end of their life to the correction system. We're calling that a poll tax. You can't charge people to vote. And that's how they want to prevent 1.4 million people from voting. And as we know, Florida is a key state, and people don't win or lose by that much. That's one state alone. But instilling the fear in people, President Trump just said on Trump TV, which is Fox News in the United States, he just said, we will have sheriffs at every polling place. I mean, sheriffs and U.S. attorneys, we'll have law enforcement threatening people. So even those people, let's say immigrants who legally have the right to vote, will be afraid that they could be targeted, not to mention overall the Black and brown communities of our country. Who knows what could happen when you come in contact with a police officer or a sheriff? We know only too well the dire consequences. So it's instilling in people tremendous fear. And then, of course, you have this taking place in the context of the pandemic, which President Trump, as he tries to take credit for being the country in the world who has best dealt with it, we are clearly the country in the world who has dealt with it the worst. This week, we have just passed 200,000 deaths. We have less than 5% of the population in the world, yet we have more than 20% of the deaths. Less than 5% of the population, more than 20% of the deaths, more than 20% of the infections. Because like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who also follows President Trump, and other tyrants, President Trump refuses to and encourages people to believe that COVID is a democratic conspiracy theory. He almost never wears a mask. And this is absolutely critical as he holds his rallies outside. Outside is good, but removing any signs that say social distancing, and of course, almost never wearing a mask himself. So he models this. And in so many of the cities he has spoken in, you see surges afterwards. One of the most horrific moments was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was speaking there originally on Juneteenth, that's June 19th, which is an extremely significant date in African-American history. It was 2 years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all enslaved Africans, but the people of Texas only heard 2 years later. And it's called Juneteenth, June 19th. And so President Trump went to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And this was at a time when we were nearing the century anniversary of one of the worst massacres of African Americans in US history, the massacring of African Americans on what was known as Black Wall Street in Tulsa. And here was President Trump saying he's going to hold his rally then. Finally, he was forced to move his rally by a day so it wouldn't fall on Juneteenth. And it was packed. And his staffers, you could see them taking off the signs on every other seat that said, don't sit here for social distancing. So people packed in. Nothing like the number of people he predicted. He predicted 1 million people would come. Maybe 6,000 people came. He was fooled by the children of TikTok, right? The high schoolers who bought up all the free tickets. They just kept reserving them. And, you know, Trump fell for it and was enraged after. It might have something to do with why he wants TikTok sold, but that's a separate story. Among the people who were at his rally was the governor of Oklahoma, Republican governor, who was the first one to come down with COVID right after the rally. And a former African-American presidential candidate named Herman Cain, who is a fierce Trump supporter, proudly sitting there in the front rows, no social distancing, no mask. And sadly, days later, he would come down with COVID, he would be hospitalized, and weeks later, he died. And in Tulsa itself, COVID-19 surged afterwards, even though the city mayor and the authorities were begging Trump, please put off this rally. You will make people sick. It doesn't deter him. He goes from state to state, tries to blame COVID on the Democrats. And as he does this and refuses the advice of his very own scientists and comes up with these crazy theories, don't worry, you can inject, Clorox in your veins and clean out your system, was the biggest proponent of hydroxychloroquine, even when his own scientists were saying, no, not only doesn't this work, but it can kill people, and continues to push these theories. And instead of simply taking solid public health measures in this country that would save so many, and particularly the African American, the Latinx communities, the Native American communities of the United States, who have been hit so hard by this pandemic, disproportionately hard. And yet the good news, fearing that everyone will now give up hope, is that the movements that have grown up in the wake of this, or the continuation, the blossoming, for example, of the Black Lives Matter movement in this country, people marching in the streets proudly with their masks, demanding justice and equity. And of course, then we had the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the horrific, the police officer sitting on his neck for over 9 minutes until, as he gasped, I can't breathe, and called out for his dead mother, he died. Which then brought attention as people rose up everywhere, because that was on videotape. It brought attention to the African-American EMT, emergency medical technician in Louisville, Kentucky, Breonna Taylor, who months before, sleeping in her bed with her partner, her boyfriend, was killed by Louisville police. 3 police officers come to her apartment. They have a no-knock warrant. That means they can slam in the door without any kind of notice. They're in plain clothes. Breonna and her partner had no idea who they were. In fact, Kenny Walker, her partner, so didn't know who it was that he had a legal gun. He shot low at one of their legs, and it was calling the police, his 911 call, please come quickly. We don't know who has just broken into our apartment, when it was the police themselves. But Breonna died in a hail of bullets, 7 police bullets. She herself was an emergency medical technician who was helping people fight COVID. But because of the killing of George Floyd and the movement that grew up in the United States and around the world, Breonna Taylor's case was reignited in the public view. Many activists locally would not let that story die, even as she did. And months later now, we've had several investigations. Sadly, the first African-American Attorney General of Kentucky just came out and indicted none of the 3 officers with her death. One of the officers was indicted for shooting into her apartment and hitting the apartment next door where a white family was living, but no one was indicted for her death. This has continued to ignite the movements all over this country, which converge with the movements that are forming and have been there to fight fascism, to fight what we see in this country as this consolidation of corporate and government power that President Trump represents in the White House. As he says, win or lose, he's staying.
Well, I mean, those of us who follow the United States regularly, Amy, have been watching this from afar. with a mixture of incredulity that these things are going on, but also with the hope that these movements will grow and grow and grow. And as we know, some of these movements have gone into the Democrats, young people who want to be members of the House, hopefully the Senate too, that there is now a core of socialists and radicals who are trying to bring about some change. That is very new as far as the last 40 to 50 years are concerned. And that is extremely positive, that even though Bernie Sanders lost out, many of those who supported him are still in there and hoping to create something. But now we also see that there is electoral opposition. I mean, all the opinion polls in the swing states are showing Trump losing. And people don't particularly care who defeats him now. They just want him out. So the fact that Biden is quite a defective guy on many levels doesn't bother people. As in the old days, you used to compare the candidates, but no one wants to compare. They want him out. My own feeling is, I know what Trump is saying, but already we've seen that a number of senior Republicans have said, no, there's no question of denying, doing anything illegal or denying a victory. And once it becomes clear that there is a victory to remove him, and were he then to try something, I think you would see mass movements in all the American cities, which would do off some of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and the movements in Oregon. I do not believe that citizens in the United States are going to take an attempt by Trump to subvert an election result, which I hope he is so obviously lost, that they're just going to sit back and say, what will happen now? And the other thing, I think it is worth saying that this also applies not to the police so much, because the police force in the United States for a very long time and under virtually every president has been a white supremacist force, even when there are blacks working in the police force. It has essentially been a repressive force to enforce white supremacy. Otherwise, you can't understand these crazy things which are going on and have been going on, whether it was Obama or Clinton or the Bushes or whoever over the last 50 years or more. But within the army, and within those people who are volunteers or sometimes conscripted or serve inside the military and know a bit of other parts of the world, I think an attempt by, many of them hate white supremacy because so many soldiers are in fact African Americans. And secondly, that is why the Pentagon got very nervous when Trump, in a show of strength, brought the army out into DC to show that he was in command. I don't think he's going to be able to get away with it, and I think there will be a very severe division.
Well, it's interesting on polls. I mean, as we know, Hillary Clinton was way ahead in the polls, and of course she won the popular vote by 3 million. But I don't think people feel so confident about the polls right now, even in those swing states. Though Biden is certainly doing better than was expected because of what Trump's doing, as you said, Tariq.
Yeah, but I mean, were Trump to be reelected, I mean, the electoral system, as we know, is screwed in the United States. It should be. The elections should take place on one person, one vote. Who gets the majority is the next president of the United States. This attempt to basically have create an undemocratic system goes way back, as you know better than me. And its aim was to keep things under control just in case things went wrong, because democracy itself was not very popular. It had to be kept under control, and they did it in this particular way. And any serious reforming president should make an attempt to change the system, because it's not serving. Now, I know the arguments against, oh, well, then the East Coast and the West Coast, their votes combined would decide who's the president. Well, it happens in every other part of the world that the people in the most populous areas have more power, but they're not all in agreement with each other. So actually the argument doesn't work, because let's say 2/3 of the West Coast votes Democrat and 1/3 Republican, and New York is, a bit higher, 3/4 vote. There are other parts of the country where it'll be the opposite. So you can't go on that basis. It's totally instrumentalist, and it doesn't work. But I think a lot of this, Amy, my view is it's bluff. As you said, what Trump is doing, he won't, if he loses quite clearly, he will not be able to do anything. His aim is to prevent people from voting. That's what he's up to, is to create fear so that people say we don't want to vote for the reasons you mentioned. So, I mean, this is now extremely important, what is going on in the United States, because this remains the world's most powerful country with enormous military power. And if democracy is trampled on, I mean the democracy that exists, I'm not talking about anything bigger than that, it'll have a very negative impact on many other continents. I think we shouldn't have too many doubts about it, but this is why I'm not that pessimistic, because I think there is now in the United States a way of doing things. Who would have thought that after the Wisconsin killing, that large numbers of people, including mayors belonging to the Democrats and senior politicians, would say, let's stop funding the police? Unheard of. Unheard of. I mean, Verso produced a book called, last year, called Ending the Police. And suddenly, as these things happen and people are saying, let's get rid of the police, in 1 month alone, a few months ago, I was told they'd sold 10,000 copies because people were desperate to read the arguments. So I think it's a strange mood. On the one hand, you have this slightly crazed, unpredictable right-wing Republican president whose own party isn't sure what is going to happen to them. On the other hand, you have a mass movement which erupts and which is now very large. I mean, what's been happening in Portland, in Oregon, is very instructive. If they try and do that sort of behavior to try and stop or not accept the election result, there will be chaos. There will be chaos, there will be pitched battles. I mean, it'll be, I don't want to exaggerate, but it certainly will be a political civil war situation. And then I think, let's hope that many of these young people in the Democrats like AOC and others will also come out and participate in these movements to try and create something very different from traditional party politics. And what you said, of course, about COVID, I was pretty convinced that Trump's attitude on the virus, on COVID-19, was so appalling that alone would lose him the election. But he's come back by making it a law and order election. Everyone who's on the streets with these, whatever he calls black people in private, deserve everything they get. And he's trying to change that. That is what worries me a bit. That many white people in the States who are not, that strong in our don't know which way to go might fall for that particular argument. But we shall see. I mean, what, in your opinion, Amy, what is the mood as such amongst sort of the newspapers, television networks, etc.?
Well, I mean, it's very interesting what's happened with the networks. You have Fox, again, as I talked about, Trump TV, and a few others even to the right of that. And then you have CNN and MSNBC. Trump calls MSNBC MSDNC, the Democratic National Committee. But what's interesting about what's happening there is, as you said, there are a number of never-Trumpers who are Republicans who have come out, people who are part of the national security state, 4-star generals as well, saying, you know, he has gone a step too far. And of course, they should have done it many steps before. But the problem with these networks that are clearly oppositional, we've never seen anything like it. It's the way any journalist should be with those in power, holding those in power accountable, whether Democrat or Republican. But because Trump has called out them by name and their reporters by name and called the media the enemy of the American people, they have found their backbone and they are speaking up and they are taking him on. But who are they taking him on with? Who is the roster, the people around the table? Not so much the Black Lives Matter movement, but very much so. The national security state is being resuscitated. Their reputations are being improved, even past Republican presidents, for example, like George W. Bush, clearly no fan of President Trump, didn't speak at the Republican convention. Think about how many people that President Bush is responsible for killing in Iraq, both U.S. soldiers and, of course, Iraqis, from Iraq to Afghanistan and beyond.
And it's still going on. It's still going on.
It is still going on. Afghanistan, the longest U.S. war in history. Now, that was President Bush. He owes a lot to Trump for resuscitating his reputation compared to what Trump is doing right now. He is hailed, his father, George H.W. Bush, hailed, the generals in the CIA, the people in the CIA, the generals in the military who are now standing up, people in Homeland Security, those who were the architects of the separation policy, this brutal policy that people in Mexico know so well because it's on the US-Mexico border, that separated Central Americans, Latin Americans, Mexicans, that separated Cameroonians and people from Africa who came up through the border and other places from their children. Horrific. But now they too have said, no, he has gone a step too far. And they are all endorsing Biden. And the question is, you know, this huge tent, and yes, so many people do feel, I mean, Bernie Sanders just gave his first address since conceding his presidential bid. And he said, this is not Trump versus Biden. This is Trump versus democracy. Noam Chomsky has called this the most important election in US history. It is so critical right now, but the question is, will the movements that have been out in the streets so bravely, and also let's not forget about the climate crisis, add that to it. You have California, Oregon, Washington State on fire. And I wouldn't say that President Trump managed with his law and order stance. He's called Portland, Seattle, and my city of New York City, jurisdictions of anarchy. So I am reporting to you from the jurisdiction of anarchy of New York City. But people are not exactly buying this. What's most recently turned the tide is the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? The liberal Supreme Court justice who, as we speak, is laying in state in the Capitol the first woman to lay in state in the Capitol, the first Jewish person to lay in state in the Capitol. Yesterday, when her body was lying in the coffin outside the U.S. Supreme Court, she was one of the 9 Supreme Court justices, President Trump, interestingly, went to pay his respects. He didn't do that for John Lewis, the great civil rights leader, but he did do that for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And as he stood there, people chanted from the steps of the Supreme Court and all around. They chanted that he should not fill her seat. They chanted for him to leave office. They certainly humiliated him, but he has power right now in choosing a right-wing Supreme Court justice that not only those in his diminishing base, but those outside see as very important, way beyond his presidency, however long he holds on to it. And that has changed the conversation a bit. Though COVID is so deathly right now in our country, and the surge is going up again, that it is hard to ignore that.
But Amy, we're talking about the Supreme Court. How come that when Obama wanted to put a judge in place, the Republicans kicked up a stink and said it's not on? And I mean, why did Obama cave in? He should have gone ahead with it.
He did nominate Merrick Garland, a middle of the road justice who should have been, the hearing should have been held. It was like 8 months before the end of President Obama's term. And the very powerful, now mind you, President Trump could not accomplish a lot in policy. He does it by edict through executive order. He's inept at this, and he's lost. The only people that remain are his family or those that can financially,
say that, but I mean, his family are writing books against him as well.
Right. But on that issue, the president nominates. It was Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, right, from that same state of Breonna Taylor, who is the Senate Majority Leader, the Republican in the upper house in the Senate, who immediately said, I mean, the president can nominate, President Obama did, and President Trump will. At this point, he will have already nominated, but not as we're speaking now. Yeah. But the question is, will the Senate go on to confirm that person? And that's what Mitch McConnell stopped. He is the brilliant strategist. Without him, Trump could not have accomplished much of anything. And he's the one who proudly in 2016 said, 8 months before the election, no way are we going to hold hearings and confirm President Obama's pick. And now he says, weeks before, in the end, it'll be less than 30 days before the election. He somehow gains power by his hypocrisy. And all of the Republicans who stood up 4 years ago and said, never could we confirm someone 8 months before, let's wait for the people to speak in the election, now proudly say, essentially, changed our minds. And that bestows on them a kind of power. An irrational leader, people are more afraid of because you don't know where they're going to turn next.
I'd like to cut in for a second here. Can we move the conversation a bit in the direction of how the election is going to impact Mexico and Latin America just for a little bit?
And I'd love you to weigh in on that. But Tariq, what about that? Let's look outside the United States because, of course, the United States may be the most powerful country on earth. But what the U.S. means for Mexico, what it means for Europe, Asia, Africa is also extremely important.
Yeah, and I mean, I think as far as Mexico and other states in South America are concerned, there will be less public attacks, but I can't see a very clear change in policy. I mean, as we know, historically, the United States have regarded South America as their backyard. Every single president has interfered. In recent years, because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, both Bush and Obama haven't had much time to interfere. Then that rogue John Bolton came in and tried to remove the government in Venezuela, which they failed to do. But where they succeeded was in removing Evo Morales from Bolivia by a combination of telling straightforward lies, manufacturing facts, and calling in the Bolivian army. Basically, that's what happened. And that country is now in a mess. Venezuela is not in a good state, but they haven't succeeded in toppling the president. And of course, as we know, Bolsonaro was backed by the Trump administration. I mean, he won a huge majority after he made sure that Lula couldn't participate in the election. So they will carry on like that, probably in a milder way, but you can't bet on that. The interesting debate is China. If you look at previous presidents, that once the Chinese developed into what they are, the American establishment was nervous, but by and large had decided that the best way to proceed is to compete with them, to argue on certain issues where you have to argue, but not enter into an explosive argument which they're going to lose. I mean, if the Trump administration and some of the secret state people advising him think that they can scare the Chinese away, that time is gone. It's not going to happen. And sending people to Taiwan or encouraging some of the more retrograde elements in Hong Kong, not all the Hong Kong people, because their demands were justified, but trying to maneuver that way is not going to work. Basically, Chinese economic development has been one of the huge success stories for capitalism or state-controlled capitalism. And they don't have to worry about too much, the Chinese state. I mean, they have their own problems, but not on the scale of the United States. They're now sitting back and watching the US administration implode, both economically and in their dealings. And what they're doing is dealing directly with countries, saying we're not going to go through the United States. Why should we? We talk directly to Germany, to Britain, to Malaysia, to Pakistan, to India, and large parts of Africa. So that is how the United States deals with China in the post-Trump period. I think, for me, is going to be one of the more interesting questions. The third aspect of all this is, of course, Europe. What is very interesting, just talking about the COVID-19 for a minute, is the deaths in Mexico have been huge, as we know, and deaths in Pakistan, in India, in Indonesia, are on an unimaginable level, but still not as high as the United States proportionately. So this is all affecting both politics and, more importantly, the economies of these countries. Amy, I would like to make this point, that we have seen pandemics before. There was the SARS epidemic, there was the Ebola epidemic. These were reported in tiny sort of columns, except on programs like yours, where we discussed them. And the reason was very clear. The West felt completely isolated and insulated from the rest of the world. Oh, that's happening here. Okay, it's bad, let's help them, give them some medicines, a bit of money. This is the first time in modern history that an epidemic has hit the West.
I wanted to ask you both about the success Trump has had with this right-wing fascist discourse against migrants, specifically in the case of Mexico and Central America. he came up, I remember when he was campaigning, he started a fight with Jorge Ramos, a Mexican journalist. He kicked him out, and he started incorporating more and more hate speech against migrants and calling Mexicans rapists and drug lords. And I was surprised at how successful he was. And I was wondering if you see in this not only an American phenomenon, but an international phenomenon, because in Europe, the hate against migrants has also worked for politicians like Boris Johnson in the UK.
I mean, it's a critical point. I mean, his racism, his xenophobia, as you said, I mean, that coming down that escalator and then talking immediately about Mexicans as rapists, and then talking about the wall that Mexico would pay for, which of course Mexico is not paying for, and the United States is, as he takes money from the military and tries to pour it into the wall. This is an area that if the Democrats do not distinguish themselves completely apart from Trump, it is something that will be one of the great failures of American history. Just this week on Democracy Now!, we've been doing a series on sterilizations of immigrants in these immigrant prisons from Georgia to Louisiana. And then we looked at the history of the sterilization of Chicana women in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s. It's not invented by Trump. A groundwork was laid, and he's taken it to new levels where a woman will be in one of these prisons and she's given a hysterectomy or her tubes are tied without her knowing that this has happened. And that's what, is the definition of genocide. You exterminate a people. And it is extremely serious. Trump has been so horrific in his language. I mean, you look at Obama before, and he deported millions of people, but his language was very respectful. Even his allies called him the deporter in chief. But he didn't speak the same way. Trump speaks the way his actions, he expresses what those actions are. The Democrats have to take a completely different tack. And if they don't, it will truly be unforgivable. And I'd love to hear Tariq on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Amy. This attack on migrants started a long, long time ago. It's carried on under every president, Amy, Democrat or Republican. No one has been able to put a stop or grab the nation by its lapels and said, look, we are a nation of migrants. We came and wiped out the native population, and we are the last people on earth who should be hostile to other migrants trying to come in. Not a single president has said that. And Obama did deport millions of migrants, but with a smile on his face, whereas Trump does it with a snarl. That's the difference, really. There's no other difference as far as dealing with migrants are concerned. And it's a similar mood in parts of Europe, not everywhere. Boris Johnson is many things. He really isn't a sort of Trumpian racist. It was his predecessor, Theresa May, who gave the orders to be tough on migrants without legal papers, who should have had legal papers, but don't, because the government has been delaying them. And they started deporting West Indians who had come here in the 60s, the Windrush people. That created a huge storm. But to be fair, it wasn't Boris Johnson who started that. And actually, if one is simply going on the basis of race, there are more senior members of government in Boris Johnson's cabinet than there have ever been in Britain, because the right, the conservative right, don't care that much. They use it to win votes, but in personal terms, the Chancellor is a very intelligent Asian guy. The Home Secretary is a horrific, what can I call her? I won't. But a disgustingly reactionary woman called Priti Patel, who attacks migrants in a much stronger language. And Europe as a whole, apart from the German government, I mean, the Italians have turned savagely against migrants. It's illegal in many countries to save migrant lives from drowning. It's illegal. People can be persecuted. And a captain of a ship, I can't remember her nationality, she said, go and take a jump yourselves. I'm going to save every immigrant I find. So this is a sort of fairly universal thing in the West, a result of the economic crisis and using migrants as scapegoats. But Europe has a long tradition of that. I mean, the United States is a country of migrants. I find it more shocking. I mean, these were people who had to leave Europe and go because of famines, because of persecutions, but they won't let others do the same. And I couldn't agree more that this is a big test. I fear they will fail it for Biden or future Democrats to end all this, for a start to dismantle this crazy wall that is creating so much sort of tragedies, multiplying tragedies for Mexicans and other migrants coming from South America. So this is a crucial issue, and we shall see. It's not come up. We'll see if it comes up in the debates, presidential debates, Amy, though I dread to think what these are going to be like, but they will have to discuss something. And this is something that at least this young layer of radical Democrat politicians should take up, regardless of whether the DNC does or not. They should take it up because they are. I mean, AOC herself is Puerto Rican. Ilham is a refugee, but also a citizen from Somalia. Rashida Tlaib is a refugee from Palestine. All these, they should take these issues up and fight on them.
Right, and it shouldn't only be on immigrants, migrants, asylum seekers' backs to make these points. It has to be on all of our backs, because most everyone, if we are not Native American, obviously come from other places. And then, of course, enslaved Africans were forced here.
I mean, Obama was, the most inventive apparition of the American empire, and Trump is the worst possible. But they serve the same wretched establishment when it comes to the end. And this is why, I don't have too many hopes in Biden, except that Trump's defeat will, I think, create a space. And because the movements have been fighting so hard, if Trump and when Trump is defeated, there will be an anticipation, what we used to call anticipatory struggle, saying, come on now, you guys, we voted you in, do A, B, C, D, E.
Yeah. I mean, look, Trump represents literally a wall. Biden represents a door in that wall that opens a crack. The question of whether that door will be kicked open or slammed shut is up to the movements in the United States to open that door, to expand that discussion. Biden's own vice presidential running mate, Kamala Harris, her family is from Jamaica in the Caribbean and from India. She embodies what it means for a family to come to this country and lay down roots. But it's not only Kamala Harris, it's most everyone in this country. And these next few weeks are absolutely critical for not only the United States.
But I think also the Mexican government, if there is a change of administration in DC in the coming months, the Mexican government should also take the initiative and start putting the pressure on, saying these restrictions are unacceptable and inhuman, and you've got to get rid of them. So if there's pressure from the outside, across the border, and from within, who knows?
That remains to be seen, Tariq. And you reminded me of when López Obrador went to Washington, which was a very contested decision here in Mexico, the only medium, the only network, because I really reviewed, I watch Democracy Now! Every day, the 15 minutes, the way Amy begins, to me, it's my daily recipe to get in contact with the world. But when López Obrador went to the US, I was very interested in seeing how his visit was covered, and it wasn't covered at all. It was just shown as a picture of him in the lawn with Trump, while nobody cared what he said. And it seems like we're losing opportunities in Mexico. The Mexican government is losing every opportunity to change the game and change the discourse. And that's one thing that worries us here in Mexico. I don't know, what was your view of López Obrador's visit to the U.S., Amy, personally?
I think many people were surprised that he came. Remember, it was supposed to be the NAFTA countries, right? This is the new NAFTA. It was going to be López Obrador, President Trump, and Trudeau. And Trudeau refused to come. So it was surprising for many people, given the way President Trump has treated Mexico.
Okay, well, I think we have more than enough, and I want to thank you both for being here. Since this is a book fair, I want to recommend two books that I really love. This one, The Street Fighting Years, Tariq's biography, which I've read several times. It's an account of his activism, his journalism, his literary tastes. It's just a wonderful introduction to Tariq's life and works. And this is a marvelous account of the history of Democracy Now!, which has been transmitting for 24 years, Amy, if I'm not making...
Yep, coming up on 25, yeah.
24 years covering the social movements, which is something that we ourselves have been doing for the past 10 years in our book fairs. So this is a book, it's in Spanish, it was published in Spain. It's not too easy to get in Mexico, but if you can get it, it's a great history of the past 24 years of movements. And Amy, really, thank you very much for accepting this chat. We hope to see you soon in Mexico, and maybe even transmitting, because, you know, the Zócalo is right next to the presidential palace. So we might even get López Obrador to maybe join us and join the party, the book party.
Very interesting. And I want to encourage people to go to democracynow.org, and democracynow.org/ES is Democracy Now! In Spanish, and our headlines every day are in Spanish, and we have a number of segments that are translated into Spanish. So come one, come all, democracynow.org.
And we have a book by Tariq. I have to remind this, when you came down in 2018, we published, if you remember, Tariq, you presented one chapter of this book. We translated it, and we gave it away at the Zócalo, so people can read that chapter for free at our website, and we invite you to also read that. And again, thank you very much, Tariq and Amy. Hope to see you soon. Take care. And
thank you so much. Stay safe, wear a mask, save lives.
Exactly.
Bye all. Great, Amy. Bye, Jose.
Bye, Tariq. Bye, Jose. Bye, Marina. Thank you.
Take care, Amy. Take care.
Thank you. Take care, please.
We love you guys.
El Gobierno de la Ciudad de México, a través de la Secretaría de Cultura, editoriales participantes y para leer en libertad, invitan a la Feria Internacional del Libro Zócalo Virtual 2020. Presentaciones, charlas, debates, homenajes y más del 9 al 18 de octubre de las 12 del día a las 12 de la noche a través de la página filzocalo.cdmx.gov.mx. No te pierdas nuestras actividades a través de nuestro canal de YouTube, todos los días de 8 a 9 de la noche y en otros horarios que puedes consultar en la página brigadaparaLeerEnLibertad.com. Búscanos en redes sociales y sigue las transmisiones para conocer nuestro catálogo de ventas y llevarte libros de regalo que podrás recoger en la Castañeda 44, Colonia Mixcoac. Feria Internacional de Libros Zócalo Virtual 2020, del 9 al 18 de octubre. Para leer en libertad.